Bradshaw Ranch in Sedona, Arizona has been producing phenomenon that researchers cannot explain for decades, but nobody had ever approached it with thermal imaging technology sensitive enough to document what the property was actually generating in the dark. When they finally did, what appeared on those cameras had no explanation, not a working theory, not a candidate cause, no explanation. Subscribe to I Believe and stay until the end, because what the thermal imaging captured at Bradshaw Ranch is the evidence this investigation has been building toward. Sedona, Arizona carries a well-documented reputation as one of the most energetically anomalous locations in the American Southwest. The red rock formations that define its landscape have drawn spiritual seekers, researchers, and investigators for generations. And the concentration of reported paranormal activity across the region is extensive enough that it has become a permanent feature of how the area is discussed in both mainstream tourism and serious investigative circles. But within that broader landscape of documented strangeness, Bradshaw Ranch occupies a category of its own, a property whose documented history of anomalous activity is so extensive, so well attested by credible witnesses across such a long span of time, and so resistant to conventional explanation that it stands apart from the general reputation of the region the way a single amplified signal stands apart from background noise. The ranch takes its name from the family that owned and operated it for decades before the weight of what was occurring on the property became impossible to manage alongside the ordinary business of running a working ranch. John and Linda Bradshaw arrived at the property as working ranchers with no particular interest in paranormal phenomenon and no framework for processing what the land began producing almost immediately after they settled onto it. What they documented across their years on the property, in accounts that have been consistent across every independent interview either of them has ever given, includes aerial objects performing maneuvers above the ranch that violated every known aerodynamic principle, physical beings of various descriptions appearing and disappearing on the property without any detectable means of arrival or departure, cattle mutilations whose surgical characteristics matched the pattern documented across hundreds of comparable cases in the American West without ever producing a conventional explanation, and physical effects on both family members and visitors that ranged from inexplicable healings to medical episodes that attending physicians could not attribute to any identifiable cause. The Bradshaws eventually left the property. The United States Forest Service subsequently acquired the land, a transaction whose specific circumstances have never been fully explained and whose timing relative to the escalation of documented activity on the ranch has been noted by researchers as more than coincidental. Access to the property became restricted. The official position on why it was acquired and what the Forest Service has observed there since taking possession has been consistent with the institutional silence that characterizes every government-adjacent engagement with this category of phenomenon across the American Southwest. Researchers who have managed to access the property in the years since the acquisition have documented a continuation of the activity the Bradshaws reported: aerial phenomenon, physical anomalies, instrument failures in specific zones, and encounters whose witness accounts carry the same quality of frightened credibility that the Bradshaw family's original reports established as the baseline for this location. What none of those prior investigations had deployed was thermal imaging technology sensitive enough to capture heat signatures in the conditions the ranch's most active zones produce at night. That changed with the investigation whose footage this video documents, and what appeared on those cameras when the thermal imaging was finally pointed at Bradshaw Ranch in the dark is what no prior investigation of the property had produced in a form this visually unambiguous. To understand why the thermal imaging footage captured at Bradshaw Ranch represents a categorical advance over every prior documentation effort at the property, it is necessary to establish what thermal imaging technology actually does and why its specific capabilities are particularly relevant to the class of phenomenon the ranch has been producing for decades. Thermal cameras do not record visible light. They record infrared radiation, heat, emitted by every object whose temperature differs from its surrounding environment. This distinction is consequential for paranormal investigation in a way that standard camera technology cannot replicate, because it eliminates the category of explanation that accounts for the majority of ambiguous paranormal footage. Standard camera anomalies, lens flares, dust particles catching light, atmospheric distortions, insects in proximity to the lens do not produce heat signatures. They are visible light phenomena that affect standard camera sensors without any corresponding thermal component. A genuine heat-emitting or heat-absorbing anomaly captured on thermal imaging cannot be explained away as a camera artifact because the camera is not recording light. It is recording temperature differential. What is visible on a thermal camera is real in the physical sense that it has a measurable thermal presence in the environment being recorded. This matters enormously at Bradshaw Ranch for a specific reason that the property's documented history establishes clearly. The phenomenon reported by the Bradshaws and by every subsequent researcher who has accessed the property has consistently included physical presences, beings, objects, and environmental anomalies that interact with the physical world in ways that produce measurable effects while simultaneously evading standard camera documentation with a consistency that researchers have noted as itself suspicious. Things that leave physical traces, that affect instruments, that produce physiological responses in human observers, and that somehow fail to resolve clearly on standard visible light camera footage despite being present in the environment those cameras are recording. Thermal imaging addresses that evasion directly. If something is physically present in an environment and has a temperature that differs from the ambient background, either warmer or cooler, a thermal camera will record it regardless of whether it is visible to the human eye or to a standard camera sensor. The investigation that deployed thermal imaging at Bradshaw Ranch was designed specifically around this capability. The researchers involved had reviewed the existing documentation record for the property and identified the specific pattern of physical presence without standard camera resolution as the evidentiary gap that thermal imaging was best positioned to close. What they captured when they pointed those cameras at the ranch's most active zones after dark is the result of closing that gap. And the result is footage that does not have the ambiguity that characterizes the prior visual documentation of Bradshaw Ranch's phenomenon. Footage in which what is present in the thermal environment of the property is visible in a form that the technology's physical operating principles make impossible to dismiss as an imaging artifact. The documented history of anomalous activity at Bradshaw Ranch predates the Bradshaw family's ownership of the property and extends into the pre-contact period through the oral traditions of the indigenous populations whose ancestral relationship to the Sedona region covers thousands of years of continuous habitation. The Yavapai and Apache peoples who maintained connection to this landscape before European contact described the specific area of the ranch in terms consistent with the class of phenomenon the Bradshaws would later document: a location of threshold, a place where the boundary between the physical world and something operating alongside it was structurally thinner than in the surrounding landscape. Those traditions were not peripheral to the cultures that maintained them. They were treated as practical knowledge, information that shaped how people moved through and interacted with the land in ways that reflected a generation's deep understanding of what the location produced and what relationship with it was appropriate. When European settlers began moving through the Sedona region in the 19th century, the accounts they generated of the area that would become Bradshaw Ranch began adding to a documentary record that has continued accumulating without interruption to the present day. Cattle ranchers operating in the region during the late 19th and early 20th centuries documented unexplained losses of livestock in the specific area of the property, losses whose characteristics matched the pattern of mutilation cases that would not receive systematic documentation for another several decades. Prospectors and survey teams working through the area produced accounts of aerial phenomenon and physical encounters that were recorded without the cultural framework to interpret them, and that were subsequently overlooked by the historical record precisely because that framework was absent. By the time the Bradshaw family arrived and began accumulating their own documentation of the property's activity, there was already a body of prior observation pointing to this specific location as a site of concentrated and sustained anomalous phenomenon extending across a time frame that predated any living witness. What the Bradshaws added to that record was systematic, first-hand, long-duration documentation by credible observers with no prior investment in paranormal phenomenon and no incentive to fabricate or embellish accounts that cost them their livelihood and eventually their home. Their record is the foundation on which every subsequent investigation of the property has been built, and it is the foundation against which the thermal imaging footage this video documents must be understood, because what the cameras captured is not an isolated anomaly in an otherwise unremarkable location. It is the latest entry in a documentary record that has been building toward exactly this kind of visual evidence for longer than any single investigation has been running. The investigation that produced the thermal imaging footage at Bradshaw Ranch was not conducted casually or without preparation. The research team that deployed the equipment had spent a significant period studying the existing documentation record for the property before committing to the investigation, identifying the specific zones of the ranch where the documented history of anomalous activity was most concentrated, and where the pattern of physical presence without visual resolution on standard cameras was most consistently reported. That preparation shaped every decision about where the thermal cameras were positioned, when the recording sessions were conducted, and how the data captured during each session was reviewed and analyzed. The equipment deployed represented the current upper boundary of commercially available thermal imaging technology, cameras capable of detecting temperature differentials of less than a tenth of a degree Celsius at distances of several hundred meters, operating across the full range of ambient temperature conditions the Sedona high desert produces across a night of recording. The sensitivity of the equipment was not a peripheral consideration. It was the central design parameter of the entire investigation architecture, because the documented behavior of the phenomenon at Bradshaw Ranch suggested that whatever was producing the physical presences witnesses had reported was operating at the threshold of standard instrument detection. Deploying equipment whose sensitivity exceeded that threshold was the investigative hypothesis, the prediction that pushing the capability level of the documentation technology above the level the phenomenon had historically been able to evade would produce the kind of unambiguous visual evidence that the property's prior investigation record had consistently approached but never fully achieved. The recording sessions were conducted across multiple nights, beginning with baseline documentation of the thermal environment of each zone during periods of no reported activity, and progressing to extended sessions in the zones the prior research had identified as most active. The baseline documentation was methodologically critical, establishing the normal thermal profile of each zone, provided the reference data against which anomalous readings could be identified without ambiguity. Every natural heat source in the recording environment was cataloged and mapped. Animal activity patterns in the area were documented. Atmospheric conditions affecting infrared radiation transmission were logged continuously throughout each session. The investigation team was rigorous in its elimination of conventional explanations before flagging any thermal anomaly as genuinely anomalous, a methodological standard that makes the footage that survived that elimination process more significant rather than less, because everything that remained after the conventional explanations were systematically applied is what appears in the recording that this video documents. What appeared in that recording during the third night of the investigation, in the zone the prior research had identified as the property's most historically active area, is what no member of the team had a ready explanation for when the session footage was reviewed the following morning. The third night of the Bradshaw Ranch thermal imaging investigation began without any indication that it would produce footage different in character from the prior 2 nights of recording. The baseline thermal environment of the target zone was within the normal variance range established during the preliminary documentation sessions. Atmospheric conditions were stable. No animal activity had been detected in the zone during the approach to the recording position. The cameras were running across their full sensitivity range, and the data was logging normally when the anomaly first appeared at the edge of the thermal frame at 11:47 in the evening. What the camera recorded in the initial frames of the anomaly's appearance is a heat signature whose dimensions and shape are immediately distinguishable from every natural thermal source the baseline documentation had cataloged for this zone. It is not an animal. The thermal profile of every native species whose range includes this section of the Sedona high desert was part of the reference database the investigation team had compiled during the preparation phase, and the signature visible in the initial frames does not match any of them in its dimensions, its heat distribution pattern, or its movement characteristics. It is not a human being. The thermal profile of a human body in the ambient temperature conditions present during the recording session is well defined and immediately recognizable on equipment of this sensitivity. A warm core with characteristic heat distribution across the limbs and head. What the camera captured does not have that profile. Its heat distribution is inverted relative to what a human body produces, cooler at the core, with the highest temperature readings at the periphery of the signature in a pattern that no known biological organism produces. The signature is present in the thermal frame for a duration of 6 minutes and 40 seconds. During that time it moves, not randomly, not in the pattern of an atmospheric thermal plume or a heat reflection from a surface source, but with a directionality and a consistency of movement that the frame-by-frame analysis the investigation team conducted establishes as purposeful. It changes direction twice during the 6 minutes and 40 seconds of its presence. Both direction changes occur at specific points in the zone that the property's prior investigation record identifies as locations of concentrated anomalous activity, the precise spots where multiple independent witnesses across the documented history of the ranch have reported the most intense physical encounters. The signature appears to know where those points are, and the manner in which it moves between them, the pace, the path, the quality of its interaction with the thermal environment of the zone during its transit, is what the investigation team has been least able to account for in conventional terms, because it does not move the way anything in the physical world that the thermal imaging technology was designed to document moves. It moves the way something moves that is aware it is being recorded, and and is not particularly concerned about it. When the investigation team reviewed the third night's footage the following morning and identified the 6-minute 40-second thermal anomaly sequence as the primary subject of their post-session analysis, the first phase of that analysis was the systematic application of every conventional explanation the team's combined expertise could generate. This phase took longer than any prior footage review in the investigation's history, not because the anomaly was subtle or ambiguous, but because the implications of ruling out every conventional explanation were significant enough that the team was rigorous to the point of redundancy in ensuring that nothing had been overlooked before proceeding to the conclusion that the footage demanded. The animal explanation was the first to be eliminated. The thermal profile of the anomaly does not match any known species in any reference database the team had access to. Its dimensions exceed the size range of every native predator in the Sedona region. Its movement pattern does not exhibit any of the behavioral characteristics of animal locomotion, as documented in the thermal imaging literature for comparable environments. The human explanation was eliminated on the basis of the inverted heat distribution profile described in the prior section, a profile that is physically impossible for a living human body to produce under any known physiological condition in any ambient temperature environment. Atmospheric thermal phenomena, heat plumes, temperature inversions, radiation reflections from surface features were eliminated on the basis of the anomaly's movement characteristics. Atmospheric phenomena do not change direction. They do not maintain consistent internal heat distribution profiles across 6 minutes of movement. They do not exhibit the quality of purposeful transit between specific locations that the frame-by-frame analysis establishes for this signature. Equipment artifact was the final conventional explanation, and the one the team examined most exhaustively because the implications of ruling it out were the most significant. The camera was tested before and after the session. Its calibration was verified against known reference sources. The specific type of artifact that could theoretically produce a moving heat signature of this profile was identified, and the conditions required to generate it were established. Conditions that were not present during the recording session, and that the concurrent data from the secondary camera unit running alongside the primary unit would have identified if they had been. The secondary camera captured the same anomaly in the same position at the same time. Two independent cameras separated by a physical distance that eliminates shared optical path artifacts both recorded the same thermal signature in the same location across the same 6-minute window. That dual camera confirmation is the single most analytically significant element of the footage. It means that whatever produced the thermal signature recorded on the primary camera was physically present in the thermal environment of the Bradshaw Ranch target zone on the third night of the investigation. It was there, both cameras documented it, and after the systematic elimination of every conventional explanation the team could generate, what it was remains without an explanation that anyone involved in the analysis has been willing to put on record. Bradshaw Ranch does not exist in isolation within the Sedona landscape. It exists at the center of a regional pattern of anomalous activity whose geographic distribution, historical depth, and cross-cultural consistency collectively argue for something operating across this entire section of the American Southwest at a scale that no single property investigation framework adequately captures. The vortex sites that define Sedona's public reputation are the tourism-facing surface of a much larger documented body of phenomenon that serious researchers have been accumulating evidence about for decades. Within that larger body, Bradshaw Ranch occupies a specific position, not simply as one anomalous location among many, but as the site where the concentration and consistency of documented phenomenon across the longest continuous span of serious investigation has produced the most substantial evidential record in the region. The aerial phenomenon documented above the ranch corresponds in its characteristics to the broader pattern of UAP activity concentrated across the American Southwest that military, civilian, and indigenous sources have documented for decades. The physical presence encounters reported by the Bradshaws and by subsequent researchers correspond in their descriptions to accounts produced by independent witnesses across the broader Sedona region and connect at a greater distance of similarity to the class of encounter documented at concentrated anomalous sites across the Southwest, including the Uinta Basin properties. The thermal imaging footage adds unambiguous physical evidence to a record that has been pointing toward exactly this kind of documentation for as long as anyone has been paying serious attention to this landscape. The Forest Service acquisition of Bradshaw Ranch has never been fully explained. The specific circumstances of the transaction, the timing relative to the escalation of documented anomalous activity on the property, the speed with which public access was restricted following the acquisition, and the consistent official silence about what has been observed on the property since it became federal land are consistent with an institutional response to phenomenon that prior government programs had already categorized and determined required managed access rather than open investigation. The AAWS-AP program's geographic scope included the broader Sedona region within its documented area of interest. The portions of the program's assessment records that have entered the public record through Freedom of Information disclosures reference concentrated UAP activity in the American Southwest in terms that correspond geographically to the Sedona region without naming specific properties. The pattern of redaction in those documents around the relevant geographic references follows the same targeted rather than blanket character documented in the Uinta Basin materials, suggesting that specific findings about specific locations were restricted rather than the geographic assessment as a whole. Researchers who have attempted systematic Freedom of Information requests about Bradshaw Ranch specifically have encountered response patterns consistent with active file management rather than simple absence of records. The government has been engaged with what this property produces. The thermal imaging footage is the first piece of public evidence that explains clearly enough why that engagement required the level of information management it apparently received.